thing with an e-bike, yeah.
Yes, it must be very nice. That
When we
performance,
eventually
obviously.
get down to it.
Hello. This week, I was going to do a piece on the dangers of early access, but as I was writing it, it became apparent there was this really common theme that ran all the way through it. And that theme was how early access constantly mislabels itself, using terms from back in the day, long before crowdfunding, agile, or any of the processes that early access actually uses. So for this week's Jibber Jabber, since I come from software development back in the day, I present to you Katt's Guide to the Old Phases of Software Development. The world of 1995 was very different to the world of today. Bill Clinton had just been elected President of the USA. There was no Google. Microsoft would release their first version of Internet Explorer that year, and Sony the first PlayStation. And only 1 in 60 people in the UK had access to the Internet. Indeed, Britain would not even be in colour for another 4 years. 1995 was also the year I got my first job in the software development industry, and I've worked in it ever since. It's fair to say that the way software is created has changed a lot in the intervening years, and now you might hear terms like agile development or iterative or scrum when people are talking about developing software. And with things like early access, these methods and the things built into them should happen before your eyes. Back in 1995, this could never have worked, which is a shame because we're still using a lot of the phrases and terms from back in the 90s to describe how we develop software now, and it just doesn't work. And it can be easy to forget how difficult it was to get updates and patches out to your customers back in those days. Even if you were one of those lucky 1 in 60 who had access to the internet, you were on dial-up. You weren't downloading gigabytes of game updates and patches like we do today without even thinking. And for many people at the time, and for me at the time, I remember going down to the newsagent and getting the latest copy of PC Gamer for my patches, because on the front would be a disc with some demos, some free software, and if you were lucky, a patch for a game you had bought a few months before. You can tell how difficult patches were to get out because of the final patch numbers of older games. I've been getting ready for a series on classic games, and the versions I'm installing today are 1.2 or 1.4. Compare that to something like World of Warcraft, which has had hundreds of patches in its long life and will no doubt have hundreds more. Modern games can do this thing of constantly growing almost organically because of our ability to download huge amounts of data via broadband internet. But back in the day, the version of the game that appeared on the discs that went in the boxes was often the only version there would ever be. The point is, when you released a game, it had to be right. And to make sure it was right, there was a really vigorous and well understood process that was followed, and each stage had a name. And to be fair, even back then, people used these names with subtle differences depending on where you worked, but the basic ideas were the same. The first stage of the software development cycle was pre-alpha. A lot of the activity that happens in pre-alpha can look like people are just mucking about and playing around, and as far as the software goes, there's probably very little to actually see. It's a stage where all your initial planning happens, where people throw around ideas, and from a development point of view, where you might just try some stuff out to see what's possible and to see what might work. It's also the stage where your developers get to grips with all their new tools and engines and set up all the basic elements and building blocks that they're going to need to actually start developing the game. The point is, nothing has really started in pre-alpha other than all the getting ourselves ready jobs. There might be some tech demos, there might be some concept art, you might even do some animations to show off your ideas and play around with some basic game mechanics, but all the real work of creating the game starts in the next phase, unsurprisingly called alpha. Alpha is where your game would grow from the elemental stage of pre-alpha to a fully fledged working title. As the alpha progressed, more and more people would get involved. It would start off with developers writing small pieces of code and testing themselves, and it would end up with huge test teams and development departments working in tandem in a cycle of adding content, building, testing, fixing, adding more content, and so on and so forth. Things would go round and round until you got to a stage where you're getting very close to a finished product. And eventually you got to a point where your internal perspective wasn't enough. You needed to get some external feedback on how you were doing. However, you really didn't want to embarrass yourself by presenting a buggy piece of crap to the world. There was always this big flurry of testing and fixing and polishing, because this was the first time that anyone outside of your company was going to see this product. And they would see it in the next stage, called beta. Beta was all about gathering feedback from informed users. It wasn't about showing off your product or trying to sell it. It was about testing. But it was about testing the water with some real people who hadn't been involved in making the system. And that's the real difference between alpha and beta from an assurance perspective. It's the people you have involved. Imagine I've designed some funky new guild management tools in my brand new massively multiplayer game. I might invite a large interactive guild from another game to come into my beta and test the system. And I'm doing that because I want to see how they react, how they find my tools. Do they find them useful? Are they intuitive? All these sort of real user experience things from users who know their business. There is no hard and fast rule on when beta happens, but generally you shouldn't be finding masses of bugs at this stage. You should have found all the really nasty stuff in alpha testing. Beta should be about feedback on your designs you can use to polish and hone what you've already got, based on the reaction of a controlled group of real users you've invited to be part of it. It was also a chance to catch anything that people really hated before it got out to the public. Indeed, it was not unheard of for a project to go back into alpha following a badly received beta test. So far, the beta I've described you might recognise as a closed beta, and you'd be right to do so. Open betas weren't initially part of the beta process, and they come along as soon as people had widespread access to broadband. In an open beta, you could badge your release as beta and get it out to thousands and thousands of people. Now, most of them would use it as a free demo, and you'd never hear from them again. But if you got it out to enough people, the small percentage of them who would give you useful feedback was significant enough to get real results, and the open beta process is born. For a software company, the best thing about this feedback is it's essentially free. Sure, you have to pay some people to manage the community and manage the open beta process, but in return you can get your game tested on thousands of different hardware setups that you could never have bought yourself. You can do volume testing on your servers, you can test your live update system, your patching mechanisms, your netcode, all this stuff, and you can do all of that without paying anyone a penny. For a development company, the only thing better than getting all this free testing was if you could somehow persuade people to pay entry for the privilege of being involved, and no one in their right mind is going to fall for that. So with open betas, the lines are starting to blur a bit between the different cycles. But whether it's an open beta or a closed beta, once you've got all your feedback, you've made the changes, you've squashed all the big bugs, and you've added some polish, you can move on to the next stage, which is release candidate. Of all the stages, release candidate does most what it says on the tin. It's something that you could release to market and sell. So you release it to your QA teams and to your marketing departments and various other people with a big badge on it saying, this could go out, we need your final approval that this is the build. It should be bug-free, or at least as bug-free as you can ever get it. It should be polished, and all the documentation copies should get written on the release candidate. There might well be multiple release candidates because people do find things at that stage, at which point it has to go back and get fixed. But hopefully you'll only have a few because of how mature your product is, and eventually one of them's going to tick all the boxes. Everyone signs off on it, and then, after a lot of work, you've finally reached the gold build. Even back in the 90s, the gold build was a term that varied in use depending where you worked, but in the places I worked, the gold build was the version that you sent to the publisher. Your publisher's job is to take your final code and burn it onto thousands of discs, print the manuals, design the pretty boxes, and get your game to the shops. Yeah, games used to be bought in shops. Often, the gold build was assigned a very significant version number, 1.0. And for some games, that would be the final version that there would ever be. But whether or not this was the case, sending out your gold build was always cause for celebration. There is a final type of build which we haven't really talked about, and that's the development build. But this isn't a separate phase, this is just the version of software which is currently being worked on and added to by development. This might be in the alpha stage, the beta stage, a release candidate, or even a patch to the gold build. The point is, it's not limited to a phase, it can happen at any time. It's ironic that the development build is probably one of the few terms from the old days that still applies to early access, and it's a shame people don't use it more. And those, my friends, are the old stages of the development process, now appearing randomly attached to an early access title near you. Why this matters, what you should do about it, and how to have a fantastic early access experience, just like I'm having at the moment with Unknown Worlds Subnautica, which I think is early access done pretty much perfectly, I'll explain next time. But for now, thanks for watching, we hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, a like is so appreciated, and of course if you want to see more, we'd love you to subscribe. I've been Katt, this has been a SmogPod, and we'll see you next time.